I was 72 years old when I signed away everything I owned: the house, the savings, the investments, the retirement accounts, every single asset accumulated over a lifetime. I remember the lawyer's face more than I remember my own handwriting that day. His hands were shaking, his voice cracked, his eyes begged me to stop. "Please," he said quietly, leaning forward across the polished conference table. "Mrs. Adler, you don't have to do this." But I did. And I knew something no one else in that room knew. Not my lawyer, not my soon-to-be ex-husband, not even the judge who would later approve the settlement. I had already won. The divorce papers lay neatly stacked between us, clipped in color, coded. A lifetime reduced to ink, signatures, and clauses. The air smelled faintly of old leather and legal paper, the scent of finality. My husband, Richard Adler, sat across from me, 75 years old. Well, groomed, perfectly composed, he looked like a man who believed he was about to walk away victorious, and in a way, he was right. On paper, Richard had always loved appearances. He loved the illusion of control, the image of success, the quiet satisfaction of believing he had outmaneuvered everyone in the room, including me, especially me. After 46 years of marriage, he thought he knew me completely. That was his greatest mistake. Our divorce shocked everyone, friends, neighbors, even our children. After all these years, they asked, "At your age?" They whispered, but people don't realize something about long marriages. They don't end suddenly. They end quietly, slowly, with small betrayals that pile up until love collapses under their weight. By the time I filed for divorce, the marriage had already been dead for years. I had simply been waiting. Richard had changed, or maybe he hadn't. Maybe I had just stopped pretending not to notice the dismissive comments, the financial control, the way he spoke to me like I was a dependent, not a partner. "You don't need to worry about money," he would say, waving me off. "I handle that. For decades, I let him. I trusted him. I loved him. I believed that sharing a life meant sharing power. But over time, handling things became hiding things, accounts I didn't recognize, statements I never saw, decisions made without me. When I asked questions, he laughed. Why would you even want to understand this stuff at your age? That sentence lodged itself in my chest like a stone. At my age, the final straw came quietly, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a moment of clarity. I was sitting at the kitchen table one morning, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching Richard scroll through his phone with that smug half-smile he wore when he thought he was clever. "Who's that?" I asked, nodding toward the screen. He locked it instantly. "Business," he said. It wasn't. I knew it. He knew I knew it, but he also knew something else. He knew I had always chosen peace over confrontation. Until that morning, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't accuse. I simply stood up, took my mug to the sink and said, "I want a divorce." He laughed, actually laughed at our age. He scoffed, "Don't be ridiculous." But when he saw my face, the laughter faded. He realized then that I wasn't asking. The weeks that followed were surreal. Lawyers, paperwork, phone calls. Richard was furious not because he was losing me, but because he was losing control. He assumed I would fight. He assumed I would demand my share. He assumed I would cling to what we'd built together. Instead, I surprised him. "I don't want anything." I told my lawyer during our first meeting. He blinked. "I'm sorry." "What?" "I want to give him everything." That was the moment my lawyer first tried to stop me. "You're entitled to half," he insisted, "at least half." "I know," I said calmly. "Then why would you walk away with nothing?" Because nothing was exactly what I wanted him to think I had. The negotiations were brief. Richard's lawyer was stunned by my lack of resistance. Richard himself was suspicious at first. "What's the catch?" he asked me one evening. "There is none." I replied, "I'm tired. I want peace." He studied my face, searching for deception. He found none, because I wasn't lying. I did want peace, just not the kind he imagined. The day of signing arrived faster than anyone expected. The conference room was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. My lawyer sat stiffly beside me, clearly distressed. Richard leaned back comfortably, already envisioning his victory. As document after document slid across the table, I signed them without hesitation. Assets transferred, accounts relinquished, properties reassigned. Each signature felt lighter than the last. My lawyer whispered urgently, You can still stop. We can renegotiate." I shook my head. Richard smirked. He thought he was watching me surrender. What he didn't know was that surrender had never been my strategy. Because years earlier, long before the divorce, long before the betrayal, I had learned a lesson about survival. A lesson taught by my mother. Always have something that's yours alone, she used to say, something no one can take. I had listened, quietly, carefully, and Richard had never noticed. When the final document was signed, the room exhaled. Richard stood and extended his hand, the picture of gracious victory. "No hard feelings," he said. "This is for the best." I took his hand. "Oh, Richard," I replied softly, "you have no idea." That evening, I returned to the house for the last time. Legally, it was no longer mine, but I wasn't there to mourn. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar surfaces, memories rising and falling like tides. Then I went upstairs to the guest room, to the closet, to the one place Richard had never looked, and I smiled, because the truth was simple. The divorce didn't make me poor. It made him careless, and that was exactly what I needed. People assume that women my age stumble into wisdom late in life. They're wrong. Wisdom doesn't arrive suddenly. It accumulates quietly through years of being underestimated. And Richard had underestimated me for decades, long before the divorce papers, long before the betrayal, long before he ever imagined I would leave. I had already learned how to disappear in plain sight. Richard believed he handled all the finances. That was the phrase he loved to use, all the finances. As if money were a thing that belonged naturally in his hands and became dangerous the moment it touched mine. At first, I accepted that arrangement willingly. We were young. He was ambitious. I trusted him. I believed marriage meant partnership, not supervision. But over time, partnership turned into permission, and permission turned into silence. It started subtly, statements arriving late, passwords changing, questions brushed aside. "Why do you need to see that? It's complicated. You wouldn't understand." Those words were never spoken cruelly. They didn't need to be. They were dismissive, and that made them far more dangerous. The first time I realized something was wrong was the day I found a bank envelope addressed only to Richard. That had never happened before. We had always received joint correspondence. Always. I held the envelope in my hands for a long moment before placing it back exactly where I found it. That was the moment I made my first quiet decision. I would stop asking, and I would start watching. People underestimate the power of observation. When someone believes you are disinterested, they become careless. Richard became very careless. He took phone calls in the next room, left documents unattended, spoke freely around me as if I were invisible. I learned more from what he didn't hide than I ever would have learned by demanding answers. Years passed. I watched him move money, shift assets, open accounts I wasn't included in. He didn't think he was stealing from me. In his mind, he was protecting me from complexity, from responsibility, from independence. The irony was painful, because the more he tried to control, the more he taught me exactly how the system worked. The turning point came one afternoon at the grocery store. I had forgotten my wallet at something that rarely happened, and I asked Richard for his card. He hesitated, just for a second, but that second told me everything. "I'll just pay," he said quickly, stepping forward. It wasn't about the money. It was about access. That night, I lay awake replaying that moment over and over. And then I remembered my mother's voice. "Always have something that's yours alone." My mother had survived a different kind of marriage, one filled with control disguised as care. She had left with nothing and rebuilt everything from scratch. She never told me details. She didn't need to. Her warning had been enough. The very next week, I opened my own account, a small one. No drama, no secrecy that would raise suspicion, just enough to exist. I didn't move money suddenly. I didn't take large amounts. I transferred slowly, quietly, methodically, amounts too small for Richard to notice, too insignificant to question. At first, I felt guilty. Then I felt cautious. Eventually, I felt empowered. What Richard never understood was that I didn't want his money. I wanted autonomy, the freedom to choose, the safety of knowing I could leave if I ever needed to. And once that seed was planted, it grew. Over the years, that small account multiplied, not recklessly, not dramatically, carefully. I educated myself quietly, books, seminars, conversations with women who had learned the hard way. I never told Richard. Why would I? He had never asked what I wanted. By the time I turned 65, I had something remarkable, not just money, but strategy. I had learned how assets could be structured, how trusts worked, how ownership could be separated from control, and most importantly, how visibility could be manipulated. Richard still believed he was the only one with financial intelligence. He still believed I depended on him. And because of that belief, he grew bolder, sloppier, more arrogant. When his behavior crossed the line from dismissive to disrespectful, I was already prepared. Not emotionally, that still hurt, but practically. I was ready. The betrayal itself wasn't shocking. What shocked me was how easily he assumed I would accept it, that I would stay, that I had nowhere to go. The night I told him I wanted a divorce, he looked at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. He was right, just not in the way he thought. The moment lawyers became involved, I knew exactly how to play the game. Richard expected war. I offered surrender. And surrender disarmed him completely. When I told my lawyer I wanted to give everything to Richard, his face went pale. "You're leaving yourself exposed," he warned. "No." I corrected gently. "I'm removing myself from the battlefield." He didn't understand. No one did, because no one saw the pieces already in motion. What Richard never considered was this: you don't win by grabbing everything. You win by letting the other person believe they have the accounts he thought mattered, the properties he fought for, the assets he gloated over. They were visible, predictable, traceable, and therefore vulnerable. The real power lay elsewhere, hidden in patience, buried in foresight, protected by structures he never imagined I would understand. When the divorce finalized, Richard celebrated quietly. He bought himself a new watch, upgraded his car, started planning a future that revolved entirely around himself. He thought he had escaped with everything intact. He thought I would fade into obscurity. Instead, I stepped into clarity. For the first time in decades, I wasn't reacting. I was directing. That night, alone in my small rented apartment, I opened my laptop. I logged into an account Richard had never known existed. I stared at the numbers, not with excitement, not with greed, but with calm certainty, because I knew something he didn't. Every move he was about to make would depend on assumptions. And every assumption he held about me was wrong. The most dangerous moment in any man's life is when he believes he has finally won. That's when caution disappears. That's when arrogance replaces strategy. That's when mistakes stop looking like mistakes. Richard didn't celebrate loudly after the divorce. He didn't need to. Victory, to him, was quiet control. Within weeks of the settlement, he began reshaping his life as if I had never existed. He sold the house, not because he needed to, but because he wanted something new. A fresh start, a visible symbol of triumph. The house had been mine in every way that mattered. The kitchen I redesigned, the garden I tended, the memories I built. Selling it was his way of erasing me. What he didn't realize was that he was erasing something else too. I found out through a mutual friend. "Oh, didn't you hear?" she said casually over the phone. "Richard's moving, bought a place near the marina." I smiled, not because it hurt less, but because it confirmed what I already suspected. He was rushing. People who rush rarely read the fine print. They assume yesterday's success guarantees tomorrow's safety. Richard had always believed that. When he sold the house, he moved large sums of money quickly. Too quickly. He consolidated accounts, closed some, transferred others. Each movement left a trail. Each trail intersected with systems he didn't realize were watching. You see, the thing about modern wealth is this: visibility isn't power, structure is. And Richard's wealth, the wealth he fought so hard to keep, was painfully exposed. He called me once during that time. "Just once, I wanted to let you know," he said, his tone falsely polite, "that I'm doing very well." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. I'm glad, I replied calmly. There was a pause. He expected bitterness. Regret, desperation, he heard none. Well, he continued, slightly unsettled, I hope you're managing. I smiled. Oh, I'm managing just fine. And I meant it. What Richard didn't know was that I had spent the last year of our marriage doing something he would have laughed at. I had asked questions, quiet ones, careful ones. I had learned how audits begin, how financial institutions flag unusual behavior, how sudden consolidation can trigger reviews. He thought experience made him immune. It made him predictable. The first letter arrived 3 months after the divorce. Not dramatic, not threatening, just curious. A routine inquiry from a financial institution regarding asset restructuring. Richard dismissed it immediately. Paperwork nonsense. He told his new companion, a woman young enough to believe confidence equaled competence. He tossed the letter aside. He never responded. That was his first real mistake. The second letter was firmer. The third came from a different department. Each one was more precise than the last, but Richard had lived too long believing rules bent for him. He assumed they always would. Meanwhile, I watched. I didn't interfere. I didn't warn him. I didn't react. I waited. Because systems move slowly until they don't. While Richard rearranged his visible assets, I finalized mine. Quiet confirmations. Signed documents, safeguards locking into place. Everything that mattered was protected. Everything that didn't, I let go. One afternoon, my lawyer called me. I have to ask. He said carefully, are you comfortable? Yes, I replied. There was a pause. You know, Richard's financial movements are raising questions. I knew. I assumed they would. I said calmly, you're not concerned. No. I said I'm prepared. Prepared. That word carries weight. It doesn't mean hopeful. It doesn't mean optimistic. It means you've already accounted for outcomes. Richard, on the other hand, had accounted only for victory. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning. I was drinking tea, watching sunlight stretch across my small living room floor when my phone rang. It was Richard. I hadn't heard his voice in months. He didn't sound confident this time. I need to ask you something, he said abruptly. Of course, I replied. Did you ever open any accounts I didn't know about? There it was, the crack in the armor. I let silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. No, I said finally. Why do you ask? They're asking questions, he muttered. Who is? I asked gently. He didn't answer, because saying it out loud would make it real. By the end of that week, his accounts were temporarily restricted. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, just enough to slow him down, enough to frustrate him, enough to expose how dependent his lifestyle was on uninterrupted access. That's when panic began to creep in. Not fear, not yet, just irritation, the kind that leads to reckless decisions. He called his lawyer, his banker, his accountant. Each one asked the same question in different ways. Why were these assets moved so quickly? Why weren't certain disclosures made? Why does this pattern look deliberate? Richard had no good answers because the truth was simple. He hadn't planned, he had assumed, and assumptions are expensive. While he scrambled, I remained invisible. No flashy purchases, no sudden changes, no signals. I didn't need to. Everything important was already insulated. The irony was painful. The divorce he thought liberated him had exposed him, and the woman he thought he'd outsmarted had stepped outside the blast radius long ago. One evening, he left a voicemail. His voice was tight. Did you know about this? He asked. You must have known something. I deleted the message without replying. Because the truth would only confuse him. He thought this was about money. It never was. Desperation doesn't arrive loudly. It creeps in quietly, disguised as irritation, as impatience, as certainty that someone else must be responsible for the discomfort you're feeling. Richard didn't think he was desperate. He thought he was inconvenienced, and that belief pushed him into the most irreversible mistake of his life. The first visible change came in his voice when he called me again, this time pretending to check in. His tone had shifted. Less smug, more measured. How are you settling in? He asked. Just fine. I said. There was a pause. I'm restructuring some things, he added casually. I see. I replied. I said nothing more. Silence is uncomfortable for people who are used to control. They fill it with truth without realizing it. I might need you to sign something, he said suddenly. There it was, the request he had rehearsed, the line he didn't want to cross, but felt forced to. What kind of something? I asked. Just a clarification, he said quickly. Old paperwork. Nothing serious. Nothing serious. That phrase again. It was the same phrase he had used every time something was very serious. I'd need to see it, I said. Of course, he replied too fast. He hung up shortly after. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The document arrived 2 days later, overnight delivery, thick envelope, legal formatting. I didn't open it immediately. I already knew what it was. Richard had assumed I would never question him again. He assumed the divorce had stripped me of authority. He assumed wrong. The document was an amendment. A retroactive clarification meant to protect him from scrutiny. It reframed past asset transfers, reassigned intent, smoothed timelines that no longer aligned. It was clever, almost, but it required one thing. My signature. I forwarded the document to my lawyer without comment. He called me within minutes. Do not sign this, he said firmly. I wasn't planning to. I replied, good. He exhaled, because this isn't protection. This is exposure. Exactly. What Richard didn't realize was that desperation doesn't just make people sloppy. It makes them visible. By trying to rewrite the past, he had alerted everyone watching that something was wrong. Banks don't panic over success. They panic over inconsistency, and Richard was now inconsistent everywhere. He called again that evening, more forceful this time. I need this signed, he said. I'm not comfortable with it. I replied. Why? He snapped. Because you never taught me to trust blindly anymore, I thought. I want my lawyer to review it fully. I said instead, that's unnecessary, he insisted. Then it won't be a problem to wait, I replied calmly. Silence, heavy, angry, telling. He hung up without saying goodbye. That was when I knew something had shifted permanently. The next week was chaos. For him. Accounts frozen longer than expected. Meetings postponed. Explanations requested. He began calling people he hadn't spoken to in years. Former colleagues, old advisors, anyone who might reassure him. No one did. Meanwhile, whispers started, quiet ones. Nothing public. Nothing dramatic. But concern spreads faster than confidence ever did. One afternoon, my lawyer called me with a tone I hadn't heard before. Something interesting has happened, he said. What's that? I asked. Richard's legal team has withdrawn from representation. I closed my eyes, not in shock, in recognition. Lawyers don't abandon clients unless the risk outweighs the reward, and Richard had crossed that line. That was the moment desperation fully took hold. He stopped pretending. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, standing there with forced composure and trembling hands. I need your help, he said. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who once told me I wouldn't understand money, at the man who laughed when I asked for equality, at the man who thought winning meant possession. I don't see how I can help, I said softly. You know things, he said. You've always known things. I almost smiled. He stepped closer. This can be fixed. He insisted. We just need to act quickly. Quickly, that word again. No, I said gently. You need to slow down. His face hardened. You did this, he said suddenly. There it was, blame. The final refuge of the unprepared. I didn't do anything, I replied, and that was the truth. After he left, I sat quietly for a long time. Not celebrating, not gloating, just acknowledging something fundamental. The balance of power had shifted, not because I attacked, but because I refused to rescue him. That night, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. Formal, polite, unmistakably official, a request for clarification, not from Richard, from an institution he could no longer influence. I read it slowly, carefully, then I smiled, because now they were asking the right questions. There is a moment in every long battle when silence breaks, not with an explosion, but with a knock, not loud, not threatening, just firm enough to say, we're here now. That moment came for me on a quiet Thursday morning. The email I had received the night before wasn't accusatory. It wasn't urgent. It was precise. A request for clarification regarding historical asset structures connected to my former marriage. No assumptions. No conclusions. just curiosity, and curiosity, when backed by authority, is never accidental. I didn't panic. Panic belongs to people who are unprepared. I read the message twice, then once more, slowly. They weren't investigating me. They were trying to understand him, and suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. I called my lawyer. They've reached out. I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end. Yes, he replied. I expected that. Am I in trouble? No, he said firmly. You're in position. That distinction mattered. We reviewed everything, every structure, every document, every decision I had made quietly over the years. Nothing had been rushed. Nothing had been hidden improperly. Nothing had crossed a line. What Richard had called nothing, my patience, my restraint, had been my protection. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Neutral location, professional tone, no hostility. Still, I prepared carefully, not defensively. Truth doesn't need defense, only clarity. Richard, on the other hand, was unraveling. He called me repeatedly. Voicemails, texts, missed calls. His messages shifted in tone, first anger, then urgency, then fear disguised as cooperation. We should talk, he wrote. This is getting complicated. We need to be aligned. As if we were still partners. I didn't respond. Silence isn't cruelty. It's boundaries. The night before the meeting, I slept peacefully. That surprised even me. But peace comes easily when you've already faced your worst outcome. And survived it. The room was simple. A table, 2 chairs, a folder placed neatly in front of me. The investigator, if that was the right word, was calm, respectful, and deliberate. Thank you for coming, she said, of course, I replied. She didn't begin with accusations. She began with listening. She asked about the marriage, the financial arrangements, my role, or lack thereof in asset management. I answered honestly. I trusted him, I said. Until I couldn't. That sentence carried decades inside it. She asked about my accounts. I provided documentation without hesitation. Clean, transparent, methodical. Her expression never changed. But I saw recognition in her eyes. This wasn't chaos. This was structure. What changed after the divorce, she asked. He consolidated. I replied, moved quickly. Did that concern you? Yes, I said, but not for my sake. That made her look up. Why not? She asked. Because people who rush usually aren't running toward opportunity. I said calmly, they're running from exposure. She nodded slowly. By the end of the meeting, something subtle had shifted. I wasn't being questioned. I was being understood, and understanding carries power. When I left the building, my phone buzzed. A message from Richard. They talked to you, didn't they? I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I replied, yes, 3 letters, nothing more. His response came immediately. What did you say? The desperation was no longer hidden. I told the truth. I wrote. There was no reply after that. 2 days later, the freeze became a restriction. Not total, not public, but significant enough to matter. Richard's lifestyle, built on fluid access, began to strain. Payments delayed, transactions questioned, plans postponed. He had lived too long believing momentum was guaranteed. He showed up again, not angry this time, broken. I never thought you'd do this, he said quietly. I looked at him carefully. I didn't do anything, I replied. That's what hurts the most, he whispered. For the first time, I felt something unexpected, not triumph, pity. You always believed I needed you. I said gently, you never considered the possibility that I was choosing you. He had no response. That was the moment Richard understood something fundamental. The divorce hadn't taken power from me. It had removed the illusion that he had ever owned it. Later that week, my lawyer called again. They're proceeding, he said. With what? Formal review. I exhaled slowly, and me. You're clear, he replied, completely. I hung up the phone and sat quietly, not celebrating, not afraid, just resolved. Richard had spent decades building a life that required constant belief. Belief from banks, from institutions, from people like me. The moment belief faded, so did the structure. And now, the questions were no longer about whether something was wrong. They were about how far it went. Secrets don't disappear, they wait. They sink into the foundations of a life and stay there, quietly shaping every decision, every fear, every overreaction. Richard had been hiding something long before the divorce. Long before the arrogance, long before the control, long before he stopped seeing me as an equal, and now that secret was beginning to surface. The first sign came in the form of a question I wasn't expecting. It arrived through my lawyer. They want to know about a business entity from 20 years ago, he said carefully, one that predates several of Richard's current holdings. I closed my eyes slowly. Because I knew exactly which entity he meant. It had been created during what Richard liked to call his most productive years, a time when he traveled frequently, when money flowed easily, when he insisted everything was under control. I remembered that phrase well. Back then I had noticed the change, the sudden long hours, the private phone calls, the new circle of associates whose names he never quite explained. But I had been busy raising children, managing a household, holding a life together, and he had been busy building something he never intended to share. The entity was registered offshore, perfectly legal, at least on the surface, but legality is a fragile thing when intent is questioned. What do they want to know? I asked my lawyer. They're asking who knew about it. He replied, and who benefited. I didn't hesitate. I didn't. I said, and I didn't. That was the truth. Richard hadn't hidden it to protect me. He had hidden it because he didn't want witnesses. When the investigators reopened that file, a timeline began to form. Transfers that didn't align with reported income. Assets that appeared and disappeared. Patterns that made sense only if you assumed deliberate concealment. Richard's panic escalated quickly after that. He stopped calling. He started pleading. Emails filled with half-explanations and desperate reassurances. We can fix this. This is just paperwork. You know I never meant to hurt anyone. Hurt, such a convenient word. It implies emotion. This wasn't emotional. It was structural. One afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered calmly. Mrs. Adler. The voice said, we need to clarify something. I listened. They weren't asking me to confess. They were asking me to confirm what they already suspected, that I hadn't been a partner in Richard's financial decisions, that I hadn't benefited from the concealed structures, that I had in many ways been deliberately excluded. Why do you think that is? The voice asked gently. I paused, because the answer was simple. He didn't believe I would understand. I said. There was silence, then, thank you for your honesty. When the call ended, I sat very still. For the first time, I understood the full shape of Richard's fear. It wasn't about money, it was about exposure. That evening he came to me again, not angry, not demanding, small. I never thought it would come back. He said quietly, secrets rarely stay buried. I replied, I did it to protect us. He insisted. I shook my head. You did it to protect yourself. He looked older in that moment, not aged, reduced. They're going to take everything, he whispered. I didn't answer. Because the truth was worse than that. They were going to understand everything. The next development came swiftly. The offshore entity was no longer theoretical. It was connected, linked to transactions, linked to decisions, linked to intent. What had once been invisible was now painfully clear. My lawyer called me late that night. They've identified discrepancies, he said, significant ones. And me, I asked. You're officially classified as uninvolved. I closed my eyes. Relief didn't come. Validation did. Richard's legal options narrowed rapidly. Where once he had maneuvered confidently, he now reacted. Where once he controlled narratives, he now contradicted himself. Every explanation spawned new questions. Every defense revealed another weakness. He tried one last tactic, appeal to history, to emotion. To me, you knew me, he said. You know I'm not a criminal. I studied his face. I knew the version of you allowed me to see. I replied. He had no answer. The truth is this. When people hide something for long enough, they begin to believe the hiding is the solution. Richard believed that, until the day it wasn't. By the end of the week, the review had become an inquiry, not public, not yet, but irreversible, and somewhere in an office far from both of us, a conclusion was forming. That the divorce wasn't an ending. It was a trigger. People keep asking me the same question. They don't say it out loud, not always, but I can see it in their faces. Why would a woman give everything away at 72? Why would anyone sign documents that strip them of security? Why didn't you fight? The truth is simple. I wasn't surrendering, I was positioning. When I signed those papers, I wasn't thinking about loss. I was thinking about exposure, because Richard had always believed one thing above all else, that control came from ownership, that if he held everything in his name, he held the truth. That assumption was his greatest weakness. You see, Richard never feared divorce, he feared division. Shared ownership meant shared scrutiny. As long as assets were split, there were questions. As long as there were questions, there was risk. So when I offered him everything, not half, not a negotiation, everything, he thought he had won. What he didn't realize was that consolidation creates clarity, and clarity invites attention. When the assets transferred fully into his name, something remarkable happened. My name disappeared from the structures, from the entities, from the filings, from the exposure. I wasn't protected by loopholes. I was protected by absence. That's why my lawyer begged me to stop. Not because it was illegal. Because it was brilliant and dangerous if misunderstood. You're removing yourself from the shield. He warned. No. I corrected him. I'm stepping out of the blast radius. Richard mistook generosity for weakness. He had done that our entire marriage. Every time I stepped back, he assumed I was incapable of stepping forward. Every time I trusted him, he assumed I was naive. And every time I stayed silent, he assumed I didn't understand. But I had watched him for decades. I knew his habits, his blind spots, his patterns. Most of all, I knew his pride. Richard couldn't resist the illusion of total victory. Once everything was his, he felt untouchable. That confidence pushed him to move faster, to consolidate further, to cut corners he would have smoothed before. He stopped being careful, and that's when the net tightened. When the investigators reviewed the assets, they saw a single controlling hand. No ambiguity, no shared responsibility, no confusion, just Richard. Every decision, every transfer, every inconsistency led back to him. I remember the moment it clicked for him. He was sitting across from me, documents spread on the table, hands shaking slightly. "You planned this?" he said, not angry, awed. "I planned for the truth," I replied. "That's not the same thing." He laughed softly, almost hysterically. "All these years," he said, "I thought you didn't understand the game." I leaned forward. I understood it well enough to know when not to play. That was when the fear truly arrived, not the fear of losing money, the fear of being seen. Richard had spent his life constructing a version of himself that required belief. Belief from banks, from partners, from institutions, from me. Once belief faltered, there was nothing beneath it but paperwork, and paperwork doesn't lie for anyone. The inquiry expanded, quietly, methodically. What began as a financial review became something heavier. Intent, pattern, duration, words Richard had never worried about before. He tried to negotiate, not with me, with time, delays, extensions, reinterpretations. But systems are patient. They wait longer than people can endure. One evening, my lawyer called with a tone I had never heard. "They understand now," he said. "Understand what? Why you gave him everything." I closed my eyes. And they're grateful you did. Richard stopped coming by after that, stopped calling, stopped trying to explain, because explanations only matter when someone still believes you. The last message I received from him was short. "You always knew." It read. I didn't reply, because yes, I had known, not everything, but enough. Enough to recognize that sometimes the safest place to stand is nowhere near the fight. There are people who believe their name is armor. That reputation alone can open doors, that familiarity can soften rules, that history earns leniency. Richard believed that for most of his life. It had worked for a very long time, until suddenly it didn't. The first sign wasn't dramatic. No headlines, no phone calls at dawn, no accusations shouted across tables. It was quieter than that. An appointment that was postponed indefinitely. A meeting that never got rescheduled. A returned email with no explanation. Richard's name still opened doors, but now people were standing behind them instead of stepping aside. Institutions don't announce when they stop trusting you. They simply slow down. They ask for more. They verify what they once accepted. They document what they once ignored, and Richard hated that more than confrontation, because delays meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant memory. The inquiry reached a new phase, not broader, deeper. They weren't asking what happened anymore. They were asking why. Why certain decisions clustered together. Why risks were taken when caution would have sufficed. Why transparency disappeared when clarity was most needed. Patterns don't care about excuses. They only care about repetition. And Richard's repetition was undeniable. I learned about the escalation indirectly. My lawyer called, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. They're preparing formal findings, he said, against him. I asked, yes, he replied, and they're no longer treating this as administrative. I didn't ask what that meant. I already knew. Richard tried one final maneuver, legacy. He reached out to old connections, people who owed him favors, names that once carried weight, but favors expire and loyalty fades when risk becomes personal. One by one, doors closed gently, but permanently, not slammed, not locked, just closed. He came to see me one last time, not pleading, not angry, defeated. I don't recognize this world anymore, he said quietly. I believed him because the world hadn't changed, the rules had just begun to apply to him. You built your life assuming belief was permanent, I said. He nodded slowly. I forgot it had conditions. The findings were issued shortly after. Not public, not sensational, but devastating in their clarity. A timeline of intent, a record of concealment, a conclusion that left no room for reinterpretation. Richard's name appeared everywhere in that document. Mine appeared once, as context, as contrast, as confirmation that separation had revealed, not hidden, the truth. The moment he understood the full weight of it came later, not when the findings were finalized, but when his own attorney stopped offering reassurance. Instead, he offered preparation. Prepare for what? Richard asked him for reality. The attorney replied, I never celebrated, not privately. Not quietly, because this wasn't about victory. It was about inevitability. Richard had spent decades managing perception. He forgot that systems don't perceive, they measure. The last update I received came in writing. Formal, precise, unemotional, the inquiry was concluding, and the next phase would begin without consultation. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not to hide it, but because I didn't need to look at it again. Richard sent one final message, not defensive, not manipulative, just honest. I thought giving me everything would save me. I stared at the words for a long time, then I typed a reply. It saved me. There is a misconception about consequences. People imagine them as loud, public, punitive, but the most powerful consequences arrive without spectacle. They arrive as silence, and silence, once it settles, is impossible to argue with. The world didn't announce what was coming for Richard. It simply stopped responding. No more negotiations, no more explanations, no more chances to clarify intent. The process moved forward without him. That was the punishment. The official notice arrived on a Tuesday. Not certified, not dramatic. Just another envelope in a stack of mail. Inside was confirmation, not accusation. A statement of next steps, a timeline, a tone that said, this is no longer a discussion. Richard called me that evening. For the first time in weeks, his voice was calm, almost relieved. It's done, he said. I didn't ask what he meant. When people reach acceptance, details become irrelevant. They won't listen anymore, he continued. I keep explaining and they just note it. I understood. Being heard feels powerful. Being recorded does not. They don't need to punish me, he said quietly. They've already decided who I am. That was the closest he had ever come to understanding the truth. I didn't correct him, because the truth was harsher. They hadn't decided who he was. They had documented who he had been. Over and over again, the silence spread outward. Accounts remained restricted. Opportunities vanished. People stopped returning calls, not out of malice but caution. No one wanted proximity anymore. Richard had always believed isolation was something you imposed on others. He never imagined it could be assigned to him. One afternoon, I ran into someone we both knew, a former associate of his. They hesitated when they saw me, then smiled politely. You must be relieved, they said carefully. I shook my head. No, I replied. I'm resolved. They didn't understand the difference, but I did. Relief implies escape. Resolution implies acceptance. The final procedural meeting happened without fanfare. No courtroom, no gallery, No verdict read aloud, just signatures, decisions finalized by people who would never meet Richard again. When it was over, there was no announcement, just permanence. Richard sent one last message after that. Not asking for help, not seeking forgiveness, just acknowledgement. I see now why you were never afraid. He wrote, I considered replying, then decided against it. Some realizations don't need confirmation. That night, I thought about the moment I signed those divorce papers, the pen heavy in my hand, the room silent, everyone watching me like I was making a mistake. I hadn't felt brave then, I had felt clear. Clarity doesn't shout, it waits. The consequences Richard faced weren't violent. They weren't theatrical, they were thorough, which is far worse. The last update came through my lawyer. It's complete, he said. There will be no further action involving you. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat quietly, not grieving, not celebrating, just finished. Richard lost more than money. He lost narrative. He lost leverage. He lost the ability to redefine himself through explanation. And I gained something I hadn't expected. Not victory, peace. People assume winning looks like revenge, like watching someone fall. Like standing above the ruins and pointing, like proof that pain was justified. But that was never what I wanted, because winning, real winning, is much quieter than that. After everything ended, the world didn't change dramatically. The sun still rose, bills still arrived, people still hurried past each other, wrapped in lives that had nothing to do with mine, and that was the point. I had returned to anonymity, to safety, to peace. Richard faded from my daily thoughts faster than I expected, not because I erased him, but because I no longer needed to understand him. Understanding is exhausting when it's one-sided. One afternoon, months later, I walked past a bank branch we used to visit together. I paused, not out of fear, but recognition. That building had once felt intimidating, powerful, exclusive. Now it was just brick and glass. What had changed wasn't the building, it was me. I had spent years believing strength looked like endurance. Like staying, like absorbing, like minimizing myself to preserve harmony. I was wrong. Strength looks like clarity. When I gave Richard everything, I didn't lose my life. I reclaimed it. I removed myself from conflict. From justification, from shared consequence, I stepped out of a story that was never written with my safety in mind. People still ask me if I regret it, if I wish I had taken more, fought harder, punished him. I tell them no, because punishment didn't belong to me. Truth did. Richard once believed I had nothing without him. What he never understood was that I had something far more valuable: time, autonomy, perspective. I don't know what his life looks like now, and that's not avoidance, that's freedom. The most profound moment came quietly. A letter from my lawyer confirming the final closure of everything. No pending issues, no further involvement, no loose ends. Just a single sentence at the bottom: you are completely clear. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not as evidence, as closure. At 72, I didn't start over. I continued, unburdened. I wake up without anxiety. I make decisions without permission. I sleep without rehearsing conversations that will never happen. That is what winning looks like, not dominance. Not applause, peace. Richard spent his life accumulating protection. I spent mine learning when to step away from danger. Only one of those strategies lasted. If there is a lesson in this story, it isn't about marriage, or money, or divorce. It's about knowing when to stop fighting the wrong battle. I didn't win because he lost. And the truth, no one expected I gave him everything, so I could walk away with what mattered most. My future.